Good morning. Welcome to our latest webinar. In our previous webinars, which you can download from our resources section on the website, we talked about kind of the first two steps of doing surveys, which are distributing it, designing it, the features that you can use as part of your survey design. In this one, what we're going to talk about is what comes after that. Talk about the ways that SmartSurvey lets you report on your data and turn the responses that you've received into insight that you can then action as part of your business. So just to introduce myself, my name's Rich. I've been working with SmartSurvey for about 5 years, and my role is that I'm what's called a product specialist. What that means is that my job is to help our clients achieve their goals using the features that we offer them. That might be directly for clients or part of advising the support team. So, like I said, in this webinar, we're going to basically be talking about our reporting features that are going to help you look at your data, understand it, or extract it for analysis in other software. This is probably going to take about 45 minutes, and after that, we'll do a question and answer session at the end. The format's going to be that we're going to look at some overall topics and cover them on some slides, and then after each topic, we're going to have a short pre-recorded demo where I'm going to show you some of these features in action. We also have our moderator, Neil, who is dealing with things in the chat if they come up during the webinar. So let's get started. The first thing to think about is that there are different ways that you can look at your data, and how you're going to want to look at your data is going to depend on what you've collected and what you want to do with it. The first way that you might want to look at your data is collectively. Are you collecting the kind of data that you're going to want to look at in aggregate? Lots of lovely numbers that you can use to define average, ranges, so on and so forth. You might want to look at your data individually. This is where you really want to look at and understand what individual people are telling you on a personal basis. This is sometimes referred to as the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, though in my experience, some fields disagree slightly on where the line is drawn between these two fields. Well, two categorizations. Do you want to look at your data internally? And that means, do you want to keep it inside SmartSurvey, use our own reporting tools to get that understanding of it? Or do you want to look at it externally? This is where you transfer the data outside SmartSurvey and use another analysis tool. That's basically the breakdown that this talk is going to be arranged into. So let's start with the first topic, which is we're going to talk about how to look at data in aggregate collectively inside SmartSurvey. The summary report is going to be your main port of call here. In fact, it's going to be the main hub for most of what we're going to talk about today. It's the first thing that you're going to see when you click the results tab while you're looking at a survey. And almost every feature that we're going to talk about as part of this is going to be accessed from here. Unsurprisingly, given the title, this is going to show you your data as a summarized report with tables and charts showing the data in an easily understandable at-a-glance format. You'll also have data about the survey status, the number of received, and the number of partial responses it's received, of which we'll talk a bit more later. On this page, you can generate custom charts for each question and export these, save these out as image files. So, as I said, this is the hub for your other reporting features. There's a nav bar at the top where you can access them. Finally, you can create links to this page to share with other people who you might want to share those results with. You can make these links secure by using a password on them. Filtering is one of the most powerful and flexible tools that you can apply when you're looking at your data, and it works on the basis of creating rules. Each rule can be set to include or exclude data that meets the criteria that's set out in the rule. These rules can be based on a huge variety of things. The most obvious one to most of our users is to use the answer to specific questions, and that's often a demographic one. But other respondent data, such as what's stored in a contact list or custom variables or the time and date of response, these can all be used as well. Each filter can be set up with multiple of these rules, so you can and create highly targeted filters that tell you exactly what you need to know. The filters you can create can be saved and then used in future on that survey. This is going to save you time if you've got particularly complex filters that you need to set up and use on an ongoing basis. One feature that's really powerful but sometimes gets overlooked is text analysis, and this does two main things. The first is that it can instantly generate a word cloud for any free text question or part of a question, like an other comment. And the size of the word in the cloud is scaled in proportion to how often it'll appear in the responses. This means that you can identify key issues for further investigation at a glance without needing to every response individually, which can save you an enormous amount of time. For further investigation, you can create categories for those text responses and assign each response into a category, in fact, into multiple categories if that's appropriate. This allows you to convert the qualitative data, the text data that people have given you, into and then run calculations on averages, that sort of thing. Another option on the summary report is to create crosstabs. When you create two questions, and the generated table will show the answers and how those answers relate to each other in terms of the responses that have been received for them. This is something that you might usually do externally by creating a pivot table in a spreadsheet, but crosstab allows you to do it without the data leaving SmartSurvey. This is another powerful tool that can get overlooked, but it's a really great way to get insights from your data with a minimum of fuss. You can also export crosstabs directly from the exporter, but we'll cover that in a little bit more detail when we show you the exporter demo. Key analysis is a feature that is intended for looking at numerical data. When it's activated, it'll show a small selection of measures based on the data that's been collected for each question. For each question, it'll show the mean, standard deviation, variance, standard error, and satisfaction rate. And actually, we've just added in the last week a minimum and maximum feature to this as well. So if these are the metrics that you're interested in for your data, you can get them without having to export and calculate the values in a spreadsheet, and this will save you time. This can also have some security benefits. If your survey has any sensitive data in it, it's beneficial to minimize the amount of exporting that needs to be done. Another feature that we've recently is the ability to hide and show questions in the summary report. And what this means is that you can decide exactly what you're going to include as part of that report. You can do this on a per question basis or per page as defined on the survey design. So if you've got a whole page that you want to drop out, you can do that with a single click. What this means is that you can customize the summary report so it only includes what you want it to for the audience it's intended for. The most common reason you might do this is where you have a survey that has information that you want to share widely or present to a wide audience, but also sensitive data that you don't. This allows you to meet that challenge without having to use separate linked surveys to compartmentalize the data. So you've got all of these customization options, and you might be wondering how they all work together. The views features allows you to save the options that you've selected in making the summary report look exactly how you want it to, and then save this into a library of presets. Once saved, you'll be able to switch between them quickly and easily. You can edit and update each view as your requirements change, create new ones, set one to be the default that's going to load when the page opens. Right, so that brings us to our first demo.
So this is the summary report.
This is the first page that you're going to land on when you want to look at the results of your survey by accessing the results tab from the top, which is up here, so on the right. We're going to take a little quick tour around the page and show you some of the features that it's got. We'll start over here on the left, which is this overview panel. This shows you some overall information about your survey. You can see the total number of responses that your survey's had, how many of those were partial, how many of those have been fully completed, and when the last response that was collected for the survey. So you can see if the survey's still active, or if, in this example, no one's responded since November. Looking at individual questions, if I scroll down a little bit to a slightly more representative question, past this one, you can see the data that's been recorded for each question is shown as a simple bar chart, so it's nice and easy to look at a glance, get an idea of what your results are. You can also see that there are percentages and raw numbers for each one. If you want to do something a little bit more interesting with charts, you can click this Create Chart button, and what this will do is show you some customizable charts with various options that you can use and export as you wish to the formats that are shown down here. Scrolling down a little bit further to some of the questions that we've got that have free text, so you can access text analysis. Any question where free text has been collected, you'll see this text analysis option. You click on that, and that will show you the word cloud, categories. This has already been categorized by us. This is one of our internal surveys that we're collecting feedback from clients. And you can see again that you can look at this categorization data as raw numbers or as a chart. And if you want to, you can export this data separately to doing your main exports. Moving back over here to the left, you have some further controls as to what you're going to include or not include in the report. The first of these is accessed via the filtering option. From here is where you would select filters that you've already created. So when the survey's been created, we've obviously created a lot of filters for how we want to do it. If you want to actually create a new filter, that's back up here at the top. Choose filtering from this option here, and creating a filter is just a matter of giving it a name, and then adding the rules that you want to be applied to that filter. So as I said in the earlier part of the presentation, you're not just looking at questions and answers, but you can also look at completion dates, response IDs, unique IDs that have been passed in via URL variables, tracking links, text analysis categories. There's a lot that you can do there, and you can build these up to make quite highly targeted filters. So we get back to the summary. In here, in the summary display options, you can switch on features like key analysis. Obviously, I already mentioned what key analysis is, but if you want to see the outcome of that, you just toggle that button to on, and these values will appear down at the bottom of this other section for each of the questions. Now, this is obviously more relevant to actual numerical answers rather than the kind of questions that we've got here, but it will always calculate them because it doesn't really care about the difference between numerical and verbal answers. It's working out these averages based on the order in which the answers are placed into the system. This one will switch on extra charts and matrix questions. If you want to clean up the display a little bit, you can hide the page titles, page numbers and question numbers from being shown. Sometimes that can make it slightly easier for people to navigate when they're looking at the report. If you have questions with open-ended text, if I scroll down a little bit further to the free text answers that we've got, these three options here are really there to help just a little bit of privacy. So if you don't want the open-ended text to be included in the report, you can do that. Or if you want the open-ended text but not be able to know who or when it was collected, you can switch those off by using those particular tabs. You can also include or remove page breaks. Finally, in this section, this is where you can hide or show questions. Now, one of the things about this particular survey is it's got quite a big question at the top, and it would make this page much easier to navigate, considering that the information in there isn't that interesting for most people. We could remove that top question, and now we can get kind of to the meat of the report without having to scroll past about 200 companies in a particular question. Now, because we've made some changes to the survey and the way it's being displayed using these controls, this is where you can use the views feature. Because we've changed from the defaults, you may have noticed this save as button has appeared. So we can save this as a view if we want to use it. So now we've saved our view, it's going to appear here in the list of available views, and at any time we will be able to choose original view and revert it back to its default. That's the end of this particular section. So what we're going to do is we're going to head back into PowerPoint, and we're going to talk through the next section, which is going to be all about the individual responses. So let's carry on, I think. So now we're going to talk about what you're going to do with individual responses inside SmartSurvey. When you click on the responses option, when you're in the Collect tab, that's how you're going to see your completed responses individually. This means you can review each response one by one and see the information that's been submitted. Just like the summary report, what you're going to see here is going to be affected by applied filters. From here, you can export a response individually into a Word or PDF file. You can also export a file of all of the responses formatted like this, but this is only available when you have fewer than 1,000 responses. Alongside completed responses, there is also partial responses. These are responses that for one reason or another have been started, but not completed. It's not affected by whether all questions have been answered, but just a response is completed when somebody reaches the final page of the survey and clicks complete, finish survey. Partial responses can still have valuable information in them, so reviewing them can be worthwhile to get your survey. One of the key and most important ones is the common dropout points, those parts of the survey that might be causing your respondents to not carry on completing it. The data in these responses isn't included when it's calculating values for the summary report, but there's an option to force a partial response to be treated as a completed response. So if you do have partial responses that are almost complete, you can include these in your aggregate data via this method. And as with the individual responses, you can export these individually or in bulk. So this is going to be our next demo. I will post once I've started playing it, I will also post the YouTube link into the chat. So here we are back at the summary report, and let's start having a look at some individual responses. You access them from the second option here on the white bar, so let's click that and take a look inside. As before, there's always the general sense that you have information and controls on the left and the actual data that you're looking at in a much larger area here on the right. Let's take a look at the information about each response. So for each response, you'll see here in the top, there's a blue response and a number 1. That is the number of the response within the context of that individual survey. Below that you have an ID, so that number is the identity of that response in the context of every response that SmartSurvey has ever collected. So you can see this particular one is the 124,872,905th response that we ever collected. You can see when the response was started and when it was ended, and there is a measure of the time that was taken to complete the response. This can be sometimes useful if you're looking at, you have concerns about people responding too quickly. This particular response was modified at some point, and we can also see the IP that the response originated from, the country that that IP relates to, and the survey translation that was in use when the response was submitted. Underneath, we have some options. You can send the response to a Word document or a PDF document, or just turn it into a print-friendly web page. You can save the response out as something else. You can click this button to edit the response. And lastly, if you want to, you can delete the response. If you're looking for a particular response, you know where it is. Sometimes if you're trying to find a particular person, you can enter a number up here, or you can use these buttons to navigate through the responses that have been collected. When you're actually looking at the details of the response, the first section is survey variables. This area is where you're going to see things like custom columns, or anything that you've passed into the survey as custom variables, so things that can change from response to response, but not the answers to questions. And then below here we have the actual details of the response that was submitted. If you want to apply filters, that's very easy. Again, you've got this nice drop down up here, so we can choose apply a filter, and you can see we've gone from the 180 or so responses that we did have collected down to 36. Because we are just seeing the responses that match the filter that we've chosen. So that's completed responses. We'll just have a very quick look at partial responses and how they differ. So this is a partial response. As you can see, it looks very similar in terms of the way the page is laid out to a completed response, with most of the same information and a couple of extra options. So we'll start over here on the left. Again, you have the response number in terms of the number within the partial responses. You have the ID. You have the date and time that it was started, but obviously you don't have a completion time and date or an elapsed time because it's not complete. And again, you have the IP, originating country, and the translation that was in use. You still have the send to Word, send to PDF, print friendly, save as options. There's two more at the bottom. The first is to force a response to be completed. Now, if you look at this particular response, the respondent skipped most of the questions in it, but answered one about the one area of SmartSurvey that they wanted to see improvements made. If we wanted to include that response within the data that is shown on the summary report, you would click force complete response, and then that's going to be looked at as part of your main data. It's going to be included in that summary report. The one below it is to generate a continue link. This is where if you get contacted by a respondent who does start the survey, doesn't finish it, and they then get in contact with you saying, oh, I'd actually quite like to finish it. If you can find their response within the system, obviously for this to work, you may have needed them to give a little bit more than the one in this example. You can click that, and that will generate a link that you can give the respondent, and they will be able to follow that and then complete the response. It works in the same way as the save and continue option. And then there's another button here to return to the top of the response. That's really it for partial responses and individual responses. So I'm just going to wrap this up now, and we're going to go back to PowerPoint, and we're going to talk about the exporter. So this is the last major section before a short bit at the end. We're going to talk about the various tools that we offer to get your data out of SmartSurvey for external analysis. The exporter page is probably the single page that we have that has the most features and options on it. And this is where, if you want to get your data out of SmartSurvey, this is where you're going to set that up. You can export summarized reports, individual responses in what I kind of call a narrative format, that linear version that we saw there, or individual responses in a tabulated format, which is probably the most common usage. We support a wide range of file types: PDF, Word, TSV, and straight to SPSS. You can apply the same filters as you would set up for the summary report. And in addition, we have some new quick access filters for dates. There's an awful lot of options here, too many to go into detail at this point, but you can control several aspects of the layout and the data that's going to be included. We're going to cover this in the demo because it makes much more sense to do it then. Once you've curated a report, you can rerun it at any time in the future without having to configure it again. You can also modify the configuration before the rerun. So if you just need to change something very slightly that you did previously, you don't have to set the whole thing up again from scratch. You can set up a completed report so that it will be sent automatically to an email address. And finally, because this is something that comes up a few times via support, if you're trying to get it into a piece of software that I haven't mentioned, use a CSV. We've yet to come across any data handling software that can't import from a CSV file. So the schedule will save yourself lots of time by setting up your exports before they need to happen. You can set a schedule of exports, one-off or repeated, that are going to run in a specified point in the future. One feature that we've added is to use the scheduler and the relative date filters that I mentioned on the previous slide to create recurring reports that are going to move forward through time as they run. So you might have a fortnightly report that's going to run every 14 days and include data only from the last 2 weeks at the point at which it runs. Again, you can set up an automated email so that each time that it runs, the people that you want to be notified or sent the report can be sent it. And once the report has been scheduled, you can still edit it and copy it. So this is going to be the last of our video bits. So I'll just set that going. Back to the last of these demonstration sections, we're going to have a look at the exporter. I'm back here on the summary report, and the way that you access the exporter is quite simply by choosing export from here on the white bar. So now we're here, let's take a quick look around. Again, we've got the standard format of controls on the left, information on the right. Here in the export settings, this is where you're going to create your exports. First thing you can choose is a name, and then underneath that is the 4 different kinds of exports that you can do. The first of these, raw response data, is by far the most commonly used. That's the raw data in a big table in a spreadsheet format. The next one underneath it is called summary data. That essentially exports something very similar to the summary report into Excel or Word, with each question on its own page. The next one is crosstab. This works quite similarly to the crosstab in the summary report. The way it differs is that when you're generating a crosstab export, you will choose one question from the survey, and then it will generate crosstabs for all of the other questions in the survey. The final option in this section is the individual responses. This is going to export all of the responses in that linear format, much like on the actual page where you're viewing the responses. This is the one that I mentioned earlier. This is limited to only being available if the survey has fewer than 1,000 responses, because otherwise the reports that it could generate would be of unreasonable size and length. Once you've chosen the type, you can choose a format. The raw response data, it's tabulated, so you've got various table formats there: CSV, XLS, SPSS, and TSV. That's tab separated. We can see that these options change based on the type of report that you're doing, or type of export that you're doing, rather. And once you've chosen what it is that you want to do, then you can customize it. Under here, there's several subtabs. We're going to go through them all. The first one, include respondent details. This is the information that you might see on the left in that little blue box when you're looking at an individual respondent in the view response. The IP address, the date and time of completion, that sort of thing. Next is the contact list column. So if you're sending a survey out from a mailing list and that has custom data in the contact list, you can include or exclude that as you want. You can include or exclude the respondent's status, and if there have been any text categories created for the survey, you can switch these on here. They will appear in a column to the right of where of the question that the text analysis categories are applied to in a single column. So if you have multiple categories for a particular response, they'll be comma separated within that column. Next, appearance. This is cosmetic things. Some people like to have date and time in one cell. Some people like to have them in two cells. So we give you the option to choose which one of those formats you want it to be using. Displaying the column headings in one row. Now, because some questions have multiple levels of questions, for want of a better word, if you've got, for example, a multiple row question where you're asking for free text, you might be asking for an address, that will have a question and several sub questions. Now, in the default format, this will consist of the question being shown on the first row and sub questions being shown on the second row of the export. For some things that you may want to import to, or for some forms of processing that you may want to do to the sheet, that sometimes isn't ideal, so you can switch this option on and this will force all of the sub questions up onto the top row. This makes it easier to do things like pivot tables, VLOOKUPs in Excel, those sorts of things. Speaking of column headings, the next option will give you the choice to, do you want to include the full question text as your column headings? Do you want to include just question codes, so Q1, Q2, as set up in the survey? Sub questions will be Q1.1, 1.2, and so on. Or do you want to use question IDs? Now, these are the individual IDs that uniquely identify the questions across all of SmartSurvey. Reasons you might do this might be, if you are handling sensitive data, or if there's sensitive data in the questions or sensitive information in the questions of the survey, and you want to be very careful about your security. By choosing the codes, then obviously you're not exposing those in the export. That also feeds into the next option, which is the answer choice style. This obviously only applies to multiple choice questions, but if you display answers as text, if the answers are red, green, blue, then red, green, blue will appear in the responses. If you choose display answers as numbers, there will be 1, 2, 3, but as long as you know 1 is red, 2 is green, 3 is blue, you'll be able to then reference that for external processing. Again, it's another way of making sure that you're, if you are handling very sensitive information, that the export sheet itself isn't a way that could get exposed. Finally, display answers as score values. If you have used scoring on your survey, you can have it export the scores instead of the values, because if you are just interested in whether a question was answered correctly or not, based on what you consider to be correctly, then you can save yourself a lot of time just by exporting the score values. The next tab is filters. The first of these options, again, that opens up our familiar filters that we've already seen when we were looking through the survey earlier in the demos. So you can choose one of those, and you can choose a date range. Now, these date ranges are what we consider smart. They look at the time that it is now, more importantly, they look at the time that it is when the survey is going to run, which is going to come up when we look at the scheduling. So we can look at today's responses, yesterday's responses, a few variants of the last 7 days based on whether you want to look at calendar weeks, the last week from midnight or the last week from the current time, month to date, previous month, these sorts of things. These are all commonly used forms of export that we've been asked for by clients at some point in the past. Choose the last 7 days for that. We can decide whether we want to include the partial responses. or not. We can decide whether we want to choose a particular response range. Now, we know that we had 180 responses to the survey. If we only wanted to look at the most recent half of them, we could put 93 in there. We just looked at the second half of the responses. This can be useful if you know when you last exported the survey and you don't want to export the stuff you've already got again. Sometimes you may know the date that it was done, and so in that case you'd use a date filter. In other cases you may know what the most recent response was in terms of its number, then you can use that to restrict it to just the new stuff. Specific pages, if you want to include or exclude particular pages from the survey. Again, this relates usually to stuff that may be sensitive or not. You can choose which of the survey pages you want to actually include in your export. Finally, we have a couple of miscellaneous options. A custom file name. This is different to the actual name that you set up at the start. The name that you set up at the start is a reference within the system. It's not the file name that will be used when it's generated. If it will make your life easier to have a particular file name for the file to have when you're going to export it and actually download it onto your computer, you can define it here. Underneath is the empty cell value. By default it is a dash, so that's for anything where the question hasn't been answered or hasn't even been asked because of skip logic, and you can change that to be blank or a 0 depending on your own requirements. So email schedule is the last section. There's quite a few things you can do in here. So if you want someone to be notified by email when a response is run, when a report is run, switch this to on and you'll get the option to enter some email recipients in this box. If you want to customize the email, that's possible here in this edit email message button. By default there's a fairly basic text only email that comes here, but you can do something more personalized, more nicer if that's what you want to do. And then finally is scheduling. So if you're putting all of this work into creating your exports, then you might want to do it more than once, or you might want to do it at some point in the future. If you know you will want to do a report at an export at the end of the month, then this is where you can set that up. The first option here is the frequency, so you can set how often it's going to repeat, if it's going to repeat at all. By default, it shows monthly repeats, but you can just set it to be a one-off. Or you can do daily, weekly, or as I said, monthly, and any number of months, days, weeks between iterations. You set your start time. Obviously that needs to be a point in the future. And then you set when it ends. So you can have it run for a certain number of iterations. So by default it ends after 30 occurrences. You can have it end on a specific date, so it will run until that date but not run after it. Or it can be never-ending, eternal and undying. You just need to choose whichever one of these is most appropriate for your survey. And clicking reset will send everything back to the defaults. This is useful if you ever kind of get lost in a deep hole of fiddling with settings and you're not entirely sure how to get back to where you want it to be. So once you've created it, click export and the export will run. It'll appear over here on the right in the list, and you just click this button to download it. If you've created a scheduled export, you click on this tab, and this is where the scheduled exports are. And this also shows any that have run but come to an end. That concludes the demo section of this webinar. So what we're going to do is we're going to head back to PowerPoint and we're just going to have a little quick talk about integrations, which is going to be all about how to make a lot of this sort of stuff happen automatically. So, as I just said on the video, this last bit is going to be a little brief talk about integrations. There won't be a demo section on this, but we think it's definitely worth mentioning as part of the overall topic. In fact, I think someone already mentioned it in the chat. This will be a very little bit techy at points, but mostly we're going to be talking about the the capabilities rather than any actual technical information of what you would need to do to set it up. So webhooks, this is kind of the simplest thing that you can do in terms of integration with an external system. It's one way. Data comes out of SmartSurvey, but nothing's going into SmartSurvey via this method. The way that it works is that it sends securely a bundle of data called a payload to a special web page on the internet called an endpoint, and it's this endpoint that's going to process the data. So you can think of it as working like having an automatic export that happens every time a response comes in. The data payloads that we use are in industry standard formats, and is JSON or and on the SmartSurvey end, you can set up a webhook on a survey in minutes. The challenge is at the other end in that you have to have some dev resource to be able to have the endpoint working and then have it process the data how you want. I mean, one example might be to have the data be automatically sent to a Google spreadsheet. And the work that you would do there is that you would need to create a script in the Google Sheet for that to work. So related to webhooks, but a little bit more complex and more capable, is the API itself. Where webhooks work one way, the API is two-way. Programs and apps send requests for data to SmartSurvey. There is a lot you can do with it. You can get information about surveys, about responses, about contact lists, subscribers to contact lists, and there's more besides. The way that it works is that an app somewhere on the internet will send a request known as a call to SmartSurvey via the API, and that request has to include some secure keys that you would have generated earlier. The API will then respond with the data that's been requested. Again, on the SmartSurvey side, this is really easy to set up. You just need to create that secure key. On the client side, obviously, there's more work involved because you have to work out exactly what you want to do, what's going to ask for the data, and what's going to process it when it comes back. But you can unlock huge benefits in terms of automation, productivity boosts, because you're no longer having to go in and have somebody fetch data manually out of the system. So you might think that this all sounds great, but you don't have the resource to do it. We do have a couple of ready-made integrations that you can use off the shelf. The first is called Zapier. This is a third-party app that we are, and it works almost like a universal translator for APIs. There's an easy interface. You can connect SmartSurvey to a huge range of apps without the need to do any programming at all. It's all with an easy-to-use graphical interface. There is an extra cost for using it, but if you're wanting to just put a toe in the water, try and find out what's the capabilities of this sort of thing, we find this to be a really great solution. They do have a free plan with limited usage, but yeah, we find it a really great way of getting small scale integrations working, and people can find out the benefits that they can get from integrations before maybe committing to actually developing their own custom-made thing. And the second is Salesforce. I don't know if you're using Salesforce. Many organizations do. We have an off-the-shelf integration that we have as a bolt-on account for our high-level accounts. You don't need to do any development at all, and setup is really easy. You can integrate SmartSurvey with a Salesforce account in the matter of a few clicks. From that point on, everything's handled within SmartSurvey. You just need to understand how Salesforce is set up. If this is something that you're interested in talking to us about, we're really happy to do demos for clients and prospective clients as well. So that's the end of this section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to see if there's anybody who has any questions.